Welcome to Peoples and Things, a podcast about human life with technology. I'm your host, Lee Vinsel, an associate professor of science, technology, and society at Virginia Tech. You can reach me with comments and suggestions at leevinsel@gmail.com or on Twitter at sts_news. I would love to hear from you. In our book, The Innovation Delusion, How Our Obsession with the New Has Disrupted the Work That Matters Most, Andy Russell and I examine how our culture's fetish for the new and shiny has distracted us from other important activities and values, including maintenance, repair, and care. Often in our society today, the word innovation just means good. It's taken to be a value in itself, which Andy and I argue it can never be. Innovation, which is just the diffusion of new things into society, can never be more than a means to an end. The question is, what end are we trying to reach? When we dig deeper into the notion of innovation, though, and ask, what is it supposed to get us? Often the answer is growth. Early innovation thinking is tied up with the history of thinking about economic growth, but the notion of innovation over the years has become associated with all kinds of growth, from organizational growth to personal growth. Growth follows a logic of addition. It's all about adding more. And yet, when we turn to maintenance, we see that growth sometimes sets us up for failure. For example, Chuck Marohn of the organization Strong Towns has argued that U.S. infrastructure policy encourages municipalities to build new infrastructure without taking into account how they're going to pay for maintenance down the road. And often, these cities lack a tax base to do that work. It was with all these thoughts in mind that I first bumped into Leidy Klotz's interesting book, Subtract, The Untapped Science of Less. As Leidy shows throughout the book, we pile on to-dos but don't consider stop-doings. We create incentives for good behavior but don't get rid of obstacles to it. We collect new and improved ideas but don't prune the outdated ones. Every day, across challenges big and small, we neglect a basic way to make things better. We don't subtract. Leidy, who is a professor of engineering at the University of Virginia, sits at a really interesting intersection between engineering, design, and experimental psychology. His pioneering research shows us what is true whether we're building Lego models, cities, or strategic plans. Our minds tend to add before taking away, and this is holding us back. Subtract is one of those books that, if it gets really deep into you, deep enough, can change the way you see the world and your own activities. I had a lot of fun chatting with Leidy, and I hope you enjoy our conversation. Get excited. Leidy, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Yeah, thank you, Lee. Some of my best friends are at Virginia Tech, and also my sister-in-law and brother-in-law now graduated from there. So
Cool, man.
I don't institutionally dislike you.
Cool. I'm too fresh to Virginia to really buy into these rivalries, so we're in a good spot, I think. So, Subtract is a neat book. When you tell strangers about it, what do you tell them it's about and what you were trying to do with it?
It's about this way of making change that we systematically overlook. And what I was trying to do with the book is help help people see that this is the potential in making change this way, and help them stop overlooking it a little bit.
Yeah, so
I really love. I mean, you have a neat kind of personal story about how you came to write this book, or like part of it. I mean, you've been thinking about subtraction for a long time, it seems like, but there was also a kind of moment it came together for you. So tell us a little bit about Legos and how it got you thinking about this problem.
Yeah, I'm playing Legos with my son, who he's 7 now, but he was 2 or 3 at the time, and we were playing with his Duplo blocks, making a bridge. And the problem we had was the bridge wasn't level, and so I tried to solve this problem. I turned around behind me to grab a block to add to the shorter column. By the time I had turned back around with the block in my hand, my son had removed a block from the longer column. And like you said, I'd always been interested in kind of minimalist design. I mean, my engineering and architecture background, I've always found those things interesting. Plus, I'm really interested in sustainability, so
Mm-hmm.
there's an inherent advantage there. But this helped me really focus in on the act. And I was like, that's what I'm interested in, the act of taking away. And even, so it was really helpful for me to hone my own thinking, also gave me a way to share that thinking with other people. So I would take the bridge problem around with me to my meetings with students and have them do it, and they would add like I did. And then I took it to my friend and collaborator, behavioral science collaborator Gabe Adams, and had her do it. And I mean, she's a genius, number one. Plus, I had been talking to her about what I thought was subtracting for a long time, trying to convince her on how we could do some basic research on it. And so I thought she would at least subtract, but she added. And then when I explained it to her, she's like, "Oh, what you're interested in is why don't we subtract to make things better?" And I was like, "Well, yeah, that's what I thought I'd been talking about all along." But
Yeah,
so it's the Lego has proven really, really helpful. And I'll say one last thing about it. I mean, we've since done a ton of research,
yeah,
but the research really maps with what happened to me in that moment, kind of analyzing it retrospectively, which is that it's not that we can't think of subtracting, it's that we think of adding first, right? And
yeah,
that's what happened to me in that moment. I thought, okay, what can I add? And I was on my way to adding before even considering if subtracting might have offered a better solution. And so it's been a really great example because as Lego's a 3-year-old, but it also maps really closely with the underlying cognitive process
hmm
that's happening and causing us to overlook subtraction in more consequential designs and changes.
yeah. So I mean, like you work at a really interesting like intersection of engineering and architecture and city planning and behavioral science. So give us just like I mean, you in the kind of first body chapter, you really go through a bunch of different experiments you did to kind of get at where this is coming from and the mechanisms and stuff. But can you just give us a taste of like a one or two of the experiments you ran um, to try to uncover this?
Well, I mean, we'll stay with Legos for the first one. So one of
Yeah.
the criticisms of the Lego bridge, right, is that, well, people just might like adding if they add to that one, right? And you basically get the same level bridge whether you add a block or subtract a block, so it's equal amount of effort. So a really easy, obvious answer there could just be that, well, adding's better. That's why we add in that scenario. And so we needed to see if that was in fact true, if that was a fair criticism. We created a Lego example where basically you're protecting a stormtrooper from getting crushed by a masonry block. And one way to solve it is to add 8 Legos. Another way to solve it is to remove one Lego.
Hmm.
And we gave people money and gave them money at the start of the experiment and charged them money for each block that they
Yeah.
moved. And so when they added, in that case, it was proof that they didn't think, not necessarily that they thought it was better, it was that they just weren't thinking of
Yeah.
the subtractive option. Now that's uh, shows that people add to their detriment, but it only when they're trying to protect a Lego from a masonry block falling. So it's a very limited
Yeah.
in kind of transferability. Probably my favorite experiment that we or the experimental setup that we used are these grid patterns on a computer screen. And so we did this with Legos, travel itineraries, writing, which I was surprised people added to writing, and we're like,
hmm
well, that goes against all the advice we get about writing, but it's a powerful bias we have to add. But all of those could be could be subject to the same criticism. Well, that's just what we do in those cases, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's just what we do when we're playing Legos. That's just what we've been taught to do when we're writing. But the grid paradigm that we developed, basically having people make grid patterns symmetrical on a computer screen, and you could change these grid patterns by adding blocks to them or by subtracting blocks from them, which we gave people practice doing ahead of time. And basically we created grid patterns that could be made symmetrical by either adding blocks to three corners or subtracting blocks from one corner.
Mm-hmm.
And we had a variety of these patterns, but that was basically the same in all of them. And so when people added to three corners in those paradigms, again with the same instructions that to do this in as few clicks as possible, that wasn't something that could be explained by, okay,
Yeah.
people just do this when playing with grids, because it's not something that they had practice with. And it also gave us a pretty useful, when we were doing the stormtrooper studies, it was really hard to get participants to do that. It takes a long time, and a lot of resources go into that. But with the computer patterns, you can do a lot of studies over and over, and we could change things really quickly. So the grid patterns, in addition to showing that people overlooked subtraction even when it was better, we could also change things about the grid patterns to help understand why this was happening. And so back to this idea of, well, is it happening because they're thinking of adding first? And so one of the things we did with the grid patterns was give people a reminder, hey, you can add or subtract to solve this.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, that increased rates of subtracting, right? That's what reminders do, but it didn't increase rates of adding.
Yeah.
So what that shows is that cognitively we're already thinking of adding, but reminding people that they can subtract brings new ideas to mind. And then the other cool manipulation that we did with those grids was put a scrolling list of numbers going by on the bottom and ask people to press an F every time a 5 went by. So basically you're distracting them.
Yeah.
And the theory there is that, we have these default thinking processes, right, that are helpful in most cases, and that's where we go automatically. And we're even more likely to go to them automatically if we're distracted by something else. And so, as expected, by the time we got to this study, at least, as expected, when people were distracted by trying to press that F key every time a 5 went by, they became even more likely to overlook subtraction and go with their adding instinct. So yeah, that's some examples of the studies, but also examples of how we kind of became more confident that this was something systematic and not just something that that happened to me when I was playing Legos with my son.
Yeah, man. I think you do a really nice job in that chapter, kind of spelling out the systematic thinking that you were doing, kind of trying to make sure, checking yourself to make sure that, go even farther.
It was it was fun to do that. And in the chapter, I hopefully make really clear how important it was to have a collaboration, just, from different perspectives, but also from different disciplinary backgrounds. And so Gabe, I mentioned, and then also Ben Converse and Andy Hales. And I also think it's something that, as someone like you who also cares a lot about communicating science to the public, showing people what's happening here, right? There is a human element to it, but also there's often like a rigor there that is implied in the paper, the official scientific paper, but doesn't, if a layperson reading that doesn't understand all the iterations and all the thinking that went into it. So it was fun to be able to write the paper, but also write the kind of, this is how the narrative of how it happened.
Yeah, man, I think you did a great job. In the book, you argue that, that there's a bunch of forces kind of pushing us in direction, and you kind of helpfully break that down into biological, cultural, and economic. So I wanted to tease this apart a little bit. Like, what, if we think in terms of evolution, or what's the advantage of being primed to focus on more or addition rather than subtraction?
Yeah. And I think, I'll talk about the evolution stuff, and just the caveat that all of these forces are overlapping, right? And intertwined. And but by thinking about these forces, I think it also helps us understand what we can do to become better at not overlooking, subtracting. So evolutionary forces, I mean, there's the obvious one that just acquiring food has been good for helping us pass down our genes. And, studies of rats or pack rats stockpiling nuts when their stash gets stolen. And you're like, well, that's obvious. That's what I do when my pantry runs out of food. I order another Instacart delivery. But the but the pack rats aren't thinking and deliberating the way that we are, right? This is just an instinctual thing that they do, and so that's a deep-rooted evolutionary instinct we share with them to acquire stuff. The other one that was really surprising, but I think really powerful to understand how deep-rooted it is competency. So I knew that this idea of like, okay, I can show that I'm doing stuff was important, right? I mean, that's obviously a reason we add, whether it's physical stuff to create monuments or going to a meeting that you're not really needed at, but if you show up, it's obvious that you're doing something. But I was surprised how deep-rooted that desire to display competence was. And so like the biological example that I use in the book is bowerbirds. These are the birds that build ceremonial nests. And the male builds a ceremonial nest. The females decide which male to mate with based on the nest. And then the female goes and builds a nest to shelter the kids. And so the whole point of that first nest is not for shelter, which is a evolutionary need, but for
showing off.
Showing off, but showing off in a very functional way, right? It's like this male that's able to build a nest is probably a male that's going to be good at collecting food. So those are good genes for my kids to have. And so this competence is really a deep-rooted thing that we're working against in a lot of cases, right? Because you can show competence by taking away, but usually the evidence is invisible, right? Even if you talk about a bowerbird that creates creates a really streamlined nest or like gets rid of the nest, they're doing something, but there's not really any evidence that they have of it. So those are some of the powerful, I think, biological forces that are kind of pulling us towards more.
And I want to talk to you a bit about the kind of intermixture of culture and psychology in a minute. But one thing I felt like a theme running through the book that you draw out in various places is just that, and you already said it with the grid experiment you did, is that like stress and time poverty and distraction seem to be things that enhance this addition versus subtraction thing. So how do you think about that? That's a really fascinating issue.
Oh, that's so reassuring. That's one thing that I wish I had drawn out even more in the book. So it's really nice to hear that you got that from the book. It's a vicious cycle, right? And so when we're busy, which is the very time that we need this, both cognitively busy, as in the scrolling numbers study, or as in like you're getting bombarded with a whole bunch of emails, that's when we're even more likely to add. And so you can see this playing out with your calendars, with your cognition. And so I think it explains a lot. And it also, I guess, it means we have to do very real work to relieve that, to kind of pull ourselves out of that reinforcing cycle and do some subtractions that could actually solve the core problem, as opposed to continuing to add.
I think
that makes sense.
It does. And I think that I think there's a question where the propensity comes from, but I do think you're right that it's something that gets worse when we're strained, and so
And that's a great, where the propensity comes from. In addition to there being all these forces that might go into why we overlook subtraction, there are also not a million, but there are a lot of cognitive and cultural and economic reasons that are not the thing that we found in our research that could also explain why we're overlooking subtraction. Hopefully I hit some of the main ones in the book. Like where this propensity comes from is there are open questions there still, and a lot of research kind of indicating, giving us some ideas there too.
So let's talk about culture for a second, and then it kind of brings some of this stuff together. So I think this is a direct quote, but maybe I was just taking notes. Cultures are born from more. Is that something you said? Something
Yeah,
close to that. Yeah. So
yeah,
say what you or what we're getting at with that notion.
well, okay, so the culture stuff, if you think of it kind of at the start of civilization, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the things that had to be there are writing, maybe some kind of like organized religion. Monumental architecture is one thing that had to be there, and so this is literally defined in, Lee, you and I like the built environment stuff, and we're
Mm-hmm.
we're nerds for it, and so I'm like, oh yeah, cool, monumental architecture, but to see it like as this fundamental thing that has to be there for
Yeah.
civilization to be a civilization was kind of a surprise to me when I found that out. But basically, monumental architecture is architecture that it's like the bowerbird's nest that exceeds any kind of obvious function for
Mm-hmm.
passing down genes, but there is like a social function to it, right? And so if you go back to some of this early monumental architecture, to build temples, to build these big structures required people coming together.
Mm-hmm.
And so when people were roaming around as bands of hunter gatherers in groups of 25, to create this monumental architecture, they actually had to organize themselves and work in groups and stay in one place, right? So
Mm-hmm.
that means, okay, how do we find stable sources of food? And so the theory is actually that, not monumental architecture had to be there at the genesis of civilizations. It also might have been the thing that like started civilizations in the first place. Now,
Yeah.
whether it just had to be there or whether it was the thing is not really important for what we're talking about here, but the fact that that's actually a conversation is really important. And so those were kind of two forms of, there's physical more there, right?
Yeah.
There's the social more there, where if some of the examples I use of subtracting in the book are subtracting rules, subtracting regulations, subtracting, the status quo. There was no status quo before this time. That for the civilizations to get built, you had to add physical stuff, you had to add these social structures, you
Mm.
had to add the information. And so, and then I think probably the place that direct quote comes from is that like cultures of more expanded and then they turned into us, right? And
Yeah.
so it's like you've got this thing where if there was a civilization like the Quakers, for example, that didn't necessarily believe in more and didn't believe in expansion, it got run over by some other
Mm.
civilization that did. Maybe the Native Americans are a better
Mm.
example, but so all over the world, the the civilizations that acquired more land, acquired more resources, um, expanded, and
Yeah.
then turned into us. And that's a big overstatement, but it's hard to find. I think most of the people listening fall into that category.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean that's actually a nice transition to like I kept thinking about like um I mean this is the kind of, as someone who does experimental psychological work, this is the kind of impossible question to ask, but it's like how much has consumer capitalism and these kind of consumer culture shaped these acquisitive things versus like how we were in, I don't know, 1825 or before then. Like how do you think about like do you think that these kind of more recent like how our culture works have ended up shaping these dimensions of us, or just like, I mean, what's your gut say here, because there's no way to check this ultimately, right?
Right, right, yeah. I I would say consumer culture has a huge influence, and I do talk about this like, economic growth dogma
Yeah,
that is,
exactly.
is relatively recent
Yep.
actually. And, there was a lot of more happening before this, but this idea that economic growth is a thing to be prized and measuring gross domestic product, which, everyone agrees is not the perfect way to measure progress.
Yeah.
What we're interested in is maybe happiness or, quality of life or some other indicator that hasn't helped.
Yes.
When when your primary measure is how much are we adding, then you're going to add. Um, but I would say that like doing this research and writing the uh, both the empirical research and the research into like these evolutionary and cultural reasons, the thing that I think is most powerful is this kind of explanation that there's just not that we're just not surrounded by evidence of subtracting.
Uh-huh.
And so it's another one of these cycles where subtracting is fighting an uphill battle, right? If
Mm-hmm.
somebody adds something to make the world better, you're walking around your Virginia Tech campus, you see this amazing library,
Yeah,
you're
yeah,
like,
yeah.
hey, adding a library works to make the world a better place. And you get evidence of this. And then next time you go to make a decision, you're like, you've got this adding example in it. Whereas if somebody say clears a derelict building from a city, creates a pocket park that looks really natural, and creates there's not really evidence that a subtraction created that after 20 years or so, right? It's just like,
Yeah.
hey, that's a nice park. And so and another example of that might be just me cleaning up around my house. If I add a new appliance in the kitchen, my wife's going to notice. If I take away one of our 15 appliances, she's probably not going to notice that I like streamlined the efficiency of the kitchen. And so I think at all these levels, when
Mm-hmm.
you add something, there's just we're bombarded by these reminders of adding, and we know that like when we make decisions, things that are top of mind are more likely to get accessed. And so I think that is, and that predates obviously the economic influence. So I
Yeah.
think um, that's where I would put like most of the blame.
Yeah, yeah.
It's like, how do you make subtraction more visible? And I'd also say that it's like on a case, it depends also on the situation, right? So like the fact that my 15 appliances in the kitchen, that's a consumer thing,
Yeah.
or mostly a consumer thing probably, and some of these other ones are more to do with the what's visible and what's not visible.
Yeah.
I don't know, what do you think?
No, I mean, like, this is one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you, because I co-wrote this book called The Innovation Delusion,
Mm-hmm.
which beats up on a kind of superficial ways of thinking about innovation, and then talks about how we neglect maintenance and repair.
Yeah.
And in that book, I mean, this is very deeply related. I think we talk about what we call the ribbon cutting paradox, which is like,
That's awesome.
like university presidents and policy, and politicians, elected officials. There's like, that you can literally create the photo opportunity, right, to do the ribbon cutting. It's much harder to do that for like maintaining something nicely or subtracting, right? I mean, I think that these two things are
Yeah.
probably very related in this way. And so, like, I heard about one activist group in New York City that was holding like phony ribbon cutting things out of like derelict subway stations to kind of get at this issue. Like, so you call it the noticeable less, and and it's like,
Yeah.
there's also the issue of the noticeable maintained, because if it's just functioning, I think it's very hard for people to like grasp that someone should be rewarded for that. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I think the maintenance, you're probably fighting an even harder battle, because the point I make with the noticeable less is like, you can make subtraction noticeable, right? You just tend to have to do more of it. If I get all the appliances out of my kitchen, my wife's going to notice that. Whether she
Yeah.
likes it or not is one thing, but when you're just like keeping things running, yeah, that's even harder. I But I do think we need to think of other ways to make that noticeable and
Yeah.
sexy, right? And I mean, I don't think the books are the solution, but I think that by you pointing it out, that's really helpful. I didn't know that you had coined the term ribbon cutting paradox, because that's something that I talk about in my classes when I'm talking about, I'm teaching a sustainability class tonight, for example, and so much of the focus is on these like fancy green new buildings,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's great. It's better than building a not green new
Mm,
building, but most of the opportunity here is in retrofitting what we've got.
yes.
And how
Amen.
do you incentivize that?
Yeah, maybe
And
not building the new building is the best thing to do environmentally, and
most of the time,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. I wanted to talk to you, a bit about incentives too. So I'm reviewing. Do you know this guy Vaclav Smil? Have you bumped into his stuff?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like Bill Gates loves him, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm working on a review of one of his recent books called Growth,
Uh-huh.
which is just this. He always writes these massive tomes, but it's just about like the idea of growth as applied to populations and technologies and systems ultimately, and in
Hmm.
his kind of very wry way. it's all about how we can't keep doing what we're doing ultimately with the environment and the planet, but it's very light touch, and he's just using the numbers to kind of like beat you over the head with it without telling you what to think. But I was reading your book and reading his book at the same time, and it was like, I kept thinking, like, what happens when our neglect of subtraction combines with like a relatively recent world full of cheap shit? Like, we've used mass production to like drastically reduce costs of everything from clothing to like all the plastic stuff we can buy at Walmart and Target, And then I was just thinking about what you're saying about this propensity that we have, to acquire and to not reduce unless we're into Marie Kondo. We'll talk about that later. It's a really interesting thing about like the propensity you're talking about, wherever it comes from, and then this changed environment, and like what ends up happening as a result of that.
Yeah. And the changed environment is that like humans are the dominant influence on the planet now,
Yeah.
right? So before, when it was adding, it's like you're making the area where your city is look different. Now you're literally changing the planet and how it supports life, human life and all other life. So the scale is much bigger. And I mean, I'm sure Smill's book is great, and like I would love to see the latest numbers on that. I mean, but the idea that there are limits to growth is not a new one,
No.
right? And it seems you can argue about where those limits are, but it's hard to argue that there are limits, right?
Yeah.
Somewhere. And and it's one of the papers that I cite in the book is this really nice study that a team of scientists did about planetary boundaries. So they defined 10 planetary boundaries, and like, where are we on these boundaries for critical life support systems? And some of these boundaries we've already exceeded, depending on how you slice and dice the numbers.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I think that, and then where does subtraction fit in, right? Because there's always been this argument, okay, well, there's the growth side where people say, well, we've got to keep growing, but what they're really saying is we've got to keep innovating and keep making progress, which I totally agree with. And then then there's another side that's like, okay, conserve, there are limits, we've got to kind of be respectful of those limits. And these are not like climate change deniers. These are both really well-meaning arguments of ways to make the world a better place.
Right.
And subtraction, I think, offers something that isn't considered a lot in those two parallel arguments, which is that you can make progress, you can continue innovating, you can continue striving, and even maybe using the current industrial model. But if you're subtracting to make progress, you're by definition not running up against these limits. I mean, just like Ezra's solution to the bridge had one less block, that saved a block, got us a level bridge. And you extrapolate that out to other types of subtractive innovation in the real world, and there might be a lot of untapped potential there. So I think if you look at it on this kind of scale of from when civilization started to where we're at now, is like, now there are way more opportunities to subtract. Yes, we've long overlooked it, but also subtracting can be a way to kind of provide the best of both worlds, where you continue to make progress, but also stay within limits. And of course, that's not a simple problem, right? This is the problem of our lifetimes. But I think that's the small role that taking away can play in it.
Yeah. But I think what you say about, subtraction and addition also could be another reason why so many people want there to be a kind of magic bullet technological solution to the problem, instead of looking at subtraction as an answer, because maybe we're just set up to be biased in that direction. I mean, there's all kinds of other reasons too about the culture of innovation and what we think of invention. I mean, there's all kinds of reasons, but it feels like another one in the mix.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, even if you look at some of the climate engineering proposals, right? It's like, I mean, there are subtractive climate engineering proposals, removing carbon dioxide from the air being one of them. But for a long time, we've got this problem of climate change, which is really, pretty clear. The technical problem is there's too much CO2 in the atmosphere, and we're thinking about, okay, how do we add less, right?
Yeah.
And very little focus on how do you take CO2 out of the atmosphere. And again, we're focusing on that more now, but we didn't for a long time.
Yeah.
And even now with climate engineering, a lot of the proposals, and I'm not an expert in climate engineering proposals, but the ones where you're like, okay, let's throw a mirror up in space and reflect the sun's rays, you're basically adding something to
Yep.
to a
Geoengineering.
problem.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. And it's just for these complex systems that we don't, it's not like anyone tried to screw up the planet
Yeah.
Initially by adding CO2 to it. It's that we didn't understand how the system worked, and we changed it, and now it's moving to a different state. But when you don't understand a system, it seems to make more sense to remove things from it that you've added to it, because at least then it's going back towards a state that you understand a little bit. So,
Yeah.
I guess the short way of that point is, I mean, adding CO2 to the atmosphere unintentionally, look where that's gotten us. And then imagine like putting these space mirrors up there, and you're thinking, well, we think it should work, but what you're doing is messing with a complex system that you don't really understand by adding stuff. I think all else being equal, taking stuff out of that complex system is going to be better.
Yes. The other, the kind of incentive-based thing I was thinking about is, so like you in the Innovation Delusion, Andy and I talk about this thing. We call it the growth mindset, and one of our heroes in the book is this guy named Chuck Marone, who runs this group Strong Towns, which is a group that tries to make municipalities like financially viable and secure. And he has this cool essay series called The Growth Ponzi Scheme. And one of the things he writes about is that the way U.S. infrastructure policy is set up is that the federal government makes it super cheap and even free for localities to borrow or take money to build infrastructure. But then what's happening is that municipalities are signing up to maintain and repair that structure in forever, until you retire the system, basically. And what he and his colleagues have shown is that a lot of times cities have as much as twice the amount of infrastructure as their tax base, okay? Because no one's holding them accountable to that. Right. So it's just like, for me, it was like thinking through your book, it was an interesting way where like, I think, the ribbon cutting paradox is one example, but this is even like the way we set up our infrastructural financial systems in a nation is really incentivizes growth and incentivizes addition, in a sense, because we don't make the costs of addition really evident, But I was just thinking about, I feel like there's all kinds of places in our culture where we really there's incentives to add, and subtracting is just not incentivized in the same way.
Yeah, I mean, the one that home square footage is another one, right?
Exactly.
It's like if you look at your Zillow home estimate and you're planning a home renovation, it makes 0 sense to do a renovation that doesn't add square footage, because it's all based on how many square feet this thing is. And that's one that, I mean, the infrastructure one is a great example too, but that's kind of more of a policy one. The square footage is like, that's us doing it to ourselves, right? That's how much we value the square footage as opposed to like the quality of the space.
I liked the moral place of your home edition in the book. It was an interesting theme to come up, to kind of think through.
Yeah, it's I ran a for your listener. I ran a contest, and this was before the Lego bridge experiment, but definitely when subtracting was on my mind. And for the students here, addition by subtraction, we moved into a small house. We had moved from a bigger house to a small house when we moved to Virginia, and we knew we were going to need to renovate it, and so I challenged the students to come up with subtractive ideas, and nobody subtracted anything. Some came up with some pretty smart ideas within the existing footprint, but then I ended up adding about 900 square feet onto the back of our house, and that's our biggest financial investment. I mean, we needed the space too. It's like we had a kid and another kid on the way, but it was really hard to get past that financial thing of like, we're not going to invest a whole bunch of money in this house and not come away with additional square footage.
Yeah.
It just doesn't make sense. So yeah, there are all these kind of forces pushing us in that direction. What's the solution for the infrastructure one? Is it to for things to cost more? I mean, my friends who study water are always saying that, we just don't pay the
Yeah.
cost of water
Yeah.
when
So,
it comes out.
I mean, there's alternative accounting systems that have been floated where, because basically existing infrastructure for municipalities isn't counted as a liability currently. So if
Okay.
you like when you're applying for new infrastructure funding, if you had to make visible how much kind of like infrastructure liability you already have on the books, you could either set a standard, or it might just be the process of making it. Some people have argued just making it visible would lead to changed behavior. I think there's an analogy. Some people say that, like, so an analogy I've heard, I've never really dug into this, is that for a long time, municipalities didn't have to count pensions as liabilities. So how much money they owed downstream to pay out to workers wasn't basically accounted for in the financial statements. And once they were forced to do that by the federal government, there was all kinds of changed behavior and also bankruptcies. So, that's the kind of stuff people have been thinking through, is how to represent it, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah. And then, I mean, so then what do you do? And then there's the whole issue of what do you do in places where like Detroit, where the infrastructure needs are shrinking, and how do you like systematically do that so that you're not paying for infrastructure for a huge city when you actually have a smaller city. Yeah, important stuff.
Yeah, I mean that's an existential kind of issue for our nation, is we do have a lot of shrinking communities that have these systems that were built for populations 50 years ago, and it doesn't make sense anymore. But it's hard to convince the federal government to bail out every city, that's facing this. So I don't know. It's really tough stuff. So, once there's a kind of 12-step moment, AA moment, where like maybe someone is convinced they have a problem around this issue of not seeing subtraction, like what are the first things you tell people about how they can kind of tack towards kind of seeing subtraction as a solution more often?
Yeah, I mean, exactly what you just said is the seeing subtraction as a solution more often, right? So just like putting this in their mind, a reminder that this in fact is an option. And I think that's a really important first step. And one of the reasons that I like talking to people like you is, I mean, I think when people listen to a podcast like this, they'll be less likely to overlook subtraction. When they read the book, even less likely to overlook it. I mean, that's like 7 hours with this idea. And then also, but I think it's also really important to put those reminders that it's an option at the point of decision making, because because you are reminded that you can subtract in Legos, then you go to plan your schedule, and all of a sudden you're right back to just adding shit onto it. It's so in these important decision making moments in your life or in your work life that may be even more influential, how can you put in place reminders to subtract? So it's like when I'm doing my weekly to-do list, can I also consider stop doings? When I'm adding, deciding what I'm gonna read for the week, which I wish I did more systematically, but like, can I also decide like, okay, here's information that I'm not gonna look at, or I'm just like gonna not read any more of these emails, because the time is finite, and the cognitive processing is all like what you can devote your full attention to is also limited. So but the main subtracting tip there is putting those reminders that this is an option at the point of making the decision. The other, having done that, I think subtracting first is a really good practice. And so we talked about the complex systems in terms of the planet before, but even just if you think about your life as a complex system, it makes sense to strip things away before you decide what to add on, because you might be adding something that fixes something that's not a problem if you subtracted in the first place. Right?
Beautiful. I like that. That's a good reminder right there.
So so subtracting first. remembering that you can that it's add and subtract,
Yeah.
not just so I mean, obviously my role is to remind people that subtracting is an option, but I'm I put an addition on my house. I'm not anti-adding. It's
Yeah.
just that we already think of that option. And one problem is that when we think of adding, if we think of adding and subtracting as opposites or like exclusive to each other, then when we add something, we're like, okay, well, subtracting is not an option. Well, in the scenarios that we're talking about, right, what we're talking about is when we encounter a situation, we try to make it better.
Yeah.
These are complementary ways to make change, right?
Yeah.
So adding can make change. So if you thought instead that, okay, I've just added something, hey, maybe I should think about subtracting something in my brainstorming or as an option, that would also be helpful. So thinking add or subtract. And then the last one, we've talked a lot about these systematic disadvantages that subtracting faces. I mean, one systematic advantage it has is that you can reuse your subtractions, right? And so we can't forget to do that. The example I use in the book is donut holes. So, and it took a long time to figure out donut holes. And so, basically people were frying dough, and the problem was that in the middle you've got this soggy piece that's not as good as the rest. Plus, there's not as much surface area to put sugar and great things. And so somebody thought to take the dough out of the middle, right? And that makes the donuts cook more evenly, more places to put sugar. But then you've also got the donut hole, right? You can reuse that and you can sell that, and you've got this byproduct. So the subtraction leaves you with something left over. And I mean, the donut holes is kind of a trivial thing. And I suppose you could mush all the dough together and make a donut. But when you talk about physical things, Ezra's Lego bridge, for example, he's left with two more blocks than I was left with, and those are blocks that you can then use for something else. And when it's your calendar, right, you subtract something off your calendar, and now all of a sudden you've got that space that you can do something else with. So just remembering that, because sometimes we don't subtract, we think, oh, well, I don't want to do it. It gives us a negative feeling. We feel bad about losing something, but you're not doing it just to take away. You're doing it because the end state that you're getting to is going to be better, and you can reuse your subtractions in that end state.
I love that. How do you think there's I like what you say about making subtraction part of the decision-making process. This is the same thing that we say about maintenance and repair, is that so often like downstream maintenance costs are not considered by decision makers when they're adding on computer systems and software systems and all this stuff to like universities, right? And then we end up with these terrible legacy systems and stuff like that. So we say like making it part of an explicit part of the decision making process. I think that's what making it a subtraction, like something you have to go through on the checklist to make sure you're really doing the work, could be really useful.
Yeah, I think it's a very basic option that we have that we're overlooking. It's the same with maintenance repair. That, I mean, one of the things when I say add and subtract, people say, oh, there's also, you can like rearrange stuff, and that's kind of what maintenance and repair is. You're working with the stuff you've got to keep it functioning the way you want it to. And so considering those basic options, it seems like we just think about adding.
Yeah. Tell us about learning by subtracting. I really like that chapter a lot. So I think this is like, when I went into your book, I was thinking about information overload like immediately as like a theme, and then you kind of that's a place where you end up going. So how do you think about the role of subtraction in learning and cognitive work in general?
Well, that's why you liked it, right? I do hit some STS people there, right? Or at least
That's
some
true.
science historians. I mean, I've got Kuhn in there, but also
Anne Blair.
Blair, and so Anne Blair, that was really surprising to me, right? Because you like, okay, this new information, the information age, we're inundated with emails, but she has this great book. I think hers is Too Much to Know. Is that it?
Yeah.
Yeah. and she talks about this has been the case since there's been information. Ever since
Yeah.
when people started writing, there were people warning of like, this is gonna
Too
too
much,
much
man.
information, too much
Yeah.
writing is gonna make the mind weary, and like really respectful period people. So this was not like a fringe thought. And so she lays out the ways that people have dealt with this throughout time. I mean, encyclopedias, right? It's like, here's the important information. There's this cool
Yeah.
project they did. It's like, what's all the, if we had to recreate civilization, that's the filter, right? That if information would help with the recreation of civilization, it goes into this document. If it doesn't go in. But then, I mean, it is true that we're facing different situations than
Yeah.
people before us have faced, right? With social media and that kind of information, um, and we do need to be able to subtract in those situations, right? And
Yeah.
make sure that this doesn't kind of overload our processing capabilities. One thing that I talk about is, I mean, the difference between working memory and uh, just stuff we know. And I mean, it's pretty. If you look at the research, we can know a lot. We can cram a lot of stuff into our brain, and the limits are very less clear there. But in terms of the things that we can actually bring to the task at hand, it's not a ton of things that we can remember. This is
Yeah.
why 5-item checklists are so effective, or just a bulleted list of things to remember. And if you get past the seventh bullet, you're basically defeating the purpose, because
Hmm.
you might be adding something useful, but if it's not as important as the other bullets, you're kind of watering down the whole thing. So
Hmm.
so like, yeah, being really conscious with what we keep in our working memory. And I think this is where I at least run into problems. It's like, oh yeah, that's interesting, that's interesting, that's
Yeah.
interesting. And
Yeah.
it's like, yeah, they're
Hmm.
all interesting, but what are the things that I want to have with me when I'm making decisions? And then the other one is just how hard it is. So that's the inundation with information. But then also when we're learning, right? We learn the exact same way. It turns out that we kind of build things. It's just we have these mental models and we add them. It's
Hmm.
even called constructivism, right? And
Yeah.
so it's like we're adding stuff that we learn to our mental models, and most of the time it's right, but it's really really hard to remove
Mm.
misconceptions from our mental models. And so
Yeah.
there's a famous psychology example where the researcher joins a cult, and these are people who believe that the doomsday is coming. And I mean, it's just such a
Hmm.
brilliant idea for an experiment, right? They believe the doomsday is coming, and so he joins the cult and sees to see what happens. And it's a good plot, a good idea, right? Because if the doomsday happens, he's good, he's in with the cult. If it doesn't happen, he's got his
Nice.
surefire paper.
Yeah.
And Of course it doesn't happen, but as he's sitting in the room, it's supposed to happen at midnight, and people start debating, well, that's not the official clock of the
Yeah.
apocalypse, right? And so they're starting to shift their beliefs. And then by about 4 o'clock in the morning, the cult leader says, it worked. Our faith has staved off
Yeah.
the doomsday, and people shift their beliefs. So, and that's, cult follow. Hopefully, a lot of us don't think the same exact way as those groups, but it's the same process by which my son's belief in Santa Claus evolves, right? I say,
Yeah.
he gets a Lego set from Santa Claus, and he's like, well, this is confusing. I didn't know that Santa could do plastic. And I say, oh, well, for stuff like that, Santa works with Amazon. And so here's
Yeah.
two things that he knows about.
Right.
And it's like, rather than subtract the notion of Santa, which
Yeah.
there's other reasons not to subtract that notion, but rather to say, oh, this thing that's in my mental model is clearly wrong based on this information I've been presented. We kind of smash
Yeah.
stuff together. And then like education scholars, there's been the whole history of misconceptions, right? And identifying these misconceptions that people come into the classroom with. It makes a ton of sense. It's like subtracting first, right? You've got to start people on if they've got this wrong idea about the sun revolves around the earth, you've got to fix that before you start teaching them new things. But they found that it's really hard to remove misconceptions. Also, it
Yeah.
takes away some of I mean, the sun earth one is one that's easy to remove in a non-controversial way, but there are also like cultural differences that can
Hmm.
be problematic if you just try to remove misconceptions. So now people, when teaching, are trying to work much more with how people actually learn, which is like we adapt the new information to the old information that we have in our mental model. So that's a hard one. I don't know if I had a surefire way to remove the wrong stuff from your mental models. I'd be screaming it from the from the rooftops.
Oh, dude, we could use that. If you come up with that killer app, let me know.
Killer app. But I do think that, just recognizing again that this is another place where it's an option, right? And, people like us spend a lot of time thinking. We could spend some of our time thinking about like, hey, here's this thing that I used to think, but now I don't think. I mean, I know for me, like some of the rethinking I've done around like the systemic nature of racism has forced me to subtract some beliefs that I had, that when I consciously evaluated, okay, what are the things that I think, it made sense to remove this notion of like a perfect meritocracy or even like a decent meritocracy. So yeah, removing wrong ideas can be powerful and also is hard.
Yes. Going back briefly to the the inundation problem, I was just when I was reading the book, I was thinking about like the feeling of busyness. And I think Schmiel, again, I was reading this while I was reading Schmiel. I think he says it's like our media consumption is now up to like 5.5 hours a day or something like that on average. And I was just thinking about like how much our feeling of busyness could be changed just through, it wouldn't be everything, but that through one change of like hanging out on Twitter or whatever. So yeah, I mean, like, how have you thought about that in your own life? And what is your relationship to media at this point, having thought about subtraction for a long time?
Yeah, Cal Newport's book were really helpful for me. He has a book on digital minimalism. He has a newer book on the world without email, but and digital minimalism really helped me with my digital life. And so like he's pretty practical with his suggestions. So one is just don't let the media control you. You control the media. So things like taking the social media off your phone, basically things that people make money when you click on it, take those things off your phone, which makes a lot of sense and kind of helps cut down that number and also allows you to still use some really useful things have happened for me through Twitter and LinkedIn, and I can still use it for stuff like that. So yeah, that's been helpful for me. I think the television is an easy one to just kind of cut out almost entirely. Or cut out binge watching. I mean, it's funny that binge watching has become this thing that like, okay, that's an acceptable thing to do, but no other form of binging is seen as a positive, right? It's like you wouldn't say I'm going binge drinking or I'm going binge eating or I'm going binge shopping. It's like
I'm going on a bender. The whole weekend is gone. As it like you don't say that as a 40-year-old person usually.
Right. And even when I was 20, I wouldn't say I was binging.
Right.
So anyway, that's back to, I think that's a really important question of like, in this fire hose of information, how do you kind of like put limits on it? And those are some really concrete ways to do so, but I think different things work for different people. But it is that's where I wanted to point out. Yeah, you mentioned 5.5 hours of media consumption, and then another information stat that stuck with me was that on average we like process 1,000 words a day or 100,000 words a day. And so like my book is 70,000 words, and a lot of those are so I mean we're like reading all this useless stuff, and it's just kind of like put in front of us, whether it's a group email or whether it's an advertisement. And if we can be deliberate about that, I mean, so think about how much better off you'd be if 3 days a week you read a book instead of encountering this other information.
I found the concept of content to be very helpful for me. I feel like you kind of allude to it in your own life, like being on the elliptical or the whatever piece of exercise equipment. I found that there was a propensity in myself to just kind of like fill up all time with like podcasts and all kinds of stuff, to always have content going. And just like, as I've really moved away from that kind of stuff in general, and social media especially. I just found my mind to be much calmer and actually able to do the things I want to do better, So,
like
yeah,
producing content, right? And
yeah,
I think, I mean, and the level at which you understand something after having produced it is, infinitely more deeply than if you had just acquired it. So yeah, I mean, I used to listen to podcasts and watch the news while running on the treadmill, and I mean, I spend a lot of time acquiring content,
hmm
and listening to podcasts and reading books, but I also, when I kind of checked myself, realized that running is when I would process things, right? It's
yeah,
that's when I would filter out ideas and figure out
yeah.
which ones, okay, yeah, this is cool, but not relevant to what I'm working on. This is the idea I need to focus on. And so I never had time for the processing that kind of turns the ideas to wisdom or knowledge
Yeah,
at least.
I liked your use of wisdom too. That's a word I've been using increasingly. So, um, what's up next, man? With you, you're going from Subtract. What's the next? Do you have a new big project, or do you have 1.5 million things going on? What's the new thing?
No, it really, one great thing about like working on the paper and the book at the same time. I mean, this paper took 18, it just took a ton
I
of
bet.
time, more than any other paper I'd worked on. Plus I was working with three other people,
Yeah,
and the book at the same time, it just really showed me the value of, I mean, not cutting out everything else, but really focusing on one good thing.
yeah,
I think, for the professors listening, obviously we have
yeah,
all these incentives to kind of slice and dice things to show that we're doing a lot, and kind of focusing on the quality of the things that we do is maybe more beneficial for society. And so yeah, definitely not. I'm trying to think of the next big thing. I'm not quite there yet.
yeah.
And
That's
it's
good
also,
too.
this is like a really unique opportunity for me to get to talk to people like you about the book and see what ideas kind of resonate with people, what things kind of bubble to the top, what the reaction is, what's needed,
Yeah,
and so
dude,
we'll
I think you
see.
could make
Yeah,
hay with this idea for a long time. Personally, I think
yeah,
if
that's
anything, you could do follow ups to it. Honestly, so
I've gotten
yeah,
a ton of, and I got to figure out, because I don't really have much interest in this, but I mean, just I've been able to talk to people in the companies that I talk to, and
yeah,
they're like, here are 5 things we're doing, and it's like, man, that would be super useful for other people. And so figuring out a way to like share those really practical tips, but also not spending my career on it, because I mean, I really like this. Um, and I think I'm kind of uniquely positioned to look at this intersection of, behavioral science and
hmm
design. And so whatever I do next as like a serious project is going to be in that vein. So anyway,
that's
yeah,
great,
but
man.
I'll keep making hay with subtraction. It's fun. It's fun to see like an idea help people, even if it's not in the way you thought it might.
Yeah. Well, I think it is a really unique book and a really creative kind of combination of fields and stuff. So, thank you so much for writing it and for taking the time to talk to me today.
Yeah, thank you, Lee, for your work, and also for taking the time to talk to me. This has been a really fun um, and productive conversation for me. It's helped shape my thinking.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of our podcast. Peoples and things, like most things in this world, depends on the work of many people. I want to thank my brother Jake Vinsel for writing the music for the show. I want to thank my buddy Juliana Castro for designing the logos for the podcast. You can check out her work at julianacastro.co. Peoples and Things is a production of Virginia Tech Publishing and the University Libraries at Virginia Tech. Production activities are supported by the Athenaeum, a space in the library that acts as a hub for digital humanities teaching, learning, and creation. Joe Ford is the Athenaeum coordinator and digital humanities specialist at VT Libraries, and he serves as producer and sound engineer for the podcast. For information about other podcasts from Virginia Tech Publishing, visit publishing.vt.edu. I also want to thank you for listening. Thanks.